I want you to take one of your hands, reach up behind your head and go to the base of your skull. Feel right where the bone stops, okay? You get the bone stop right there. And then there's a soft spot. You can feel that soft spot? Now just press in a little. Don't press in too hard. Press in just a little. Right there is a bundle of nerves called the reticular activator. And that reticular activator serves as a filter for you. It screens out the thousands and thousands of things that are competing for your attention. All the sights and sounds and smells, all the bombardment you get with stuff. And our reticular activator has had to get busier for us. Social media, our phones, all the kind of stuff. We just get inundated today, don't we, with stuff and the messaging that comes our direction. And so this reticular activator in the base of your brain filters for you. It opens windows, it closes windows. Researchers say that on average today, you hear nearly 10,000 marketing messages. That's just marketing messages. That's not Facebook stuff. That's not social media. That's not Twitter. It's not what your friends are saying. It's not what you're seeing or smelling. Marketing alone, and marketing is created to do one thing for you, isn't it? It's created to give you some level of dissatisfaction. Your life is sad. And it would be happier if you drove this car, if you lived in this house, if you wore these clothes, if you used 4-ply toilet paper. Your life would be just so much happier. One of my favorite ad campaigns was the Coca-Cola campaign. I think Coke always does great commercials. And this one was Coke Adds Life. And I thought, man, that is an awesome commercial. Coke Adds Life. And so here was the picture I had. There was an assembly line, and the Coke bottle went down the line, and somebody put in peace and joy and happiness. And then at the end, they put in the sugar and all the other stuff, right? And you pop the bottle off, and you suck that Coke down, and you get life. Coke gives me gas. How come they never tell you that in the commercials? You see, we're constantly being told there's some stuff we're missing, and we just need to have it. So what I hope to do for just a moment is to open a window for you. That's what your reticular activator does. Have you ever noticed this? Have you ever noticed maybe you got a new car to you. Maybe it's not a new car, but a new car to you. And you thought, man, I think I'm the only person in my community has this car. You buy that car, you drive off the lot, and now every corner you come to, there is a car just like that car. Ladies, have you ever bought some clothing and you thought, man, this is awesome. No one else has this clothing. You buy that dress or that blouse, and you walk outside, and everybody you run into seems to be wearing that. That's what's happened for you is something you weren't paying attention to now has been opened for you. That there is a window open. So I just want to open a brief window about what I think God is up to, because I think God is building today, and I think He's building actually in your city, in your community. We often talk about what God might be doing in other parts of the world, and we celebrate that, and we're excited about that. But I think God is up to something right in your town, right in your community. And more so, I think God wants you to love where you live. I think He wants you to love where I love to travel. I love to get to experience other things. I love to get to see other things. I love to get to be with other people. Recently, I did a trip that took me from my home near Denver to London. I was 2 days in London, then I went to Dubai for 1 night, 2 days, then Singapore for 3 days, Kuala Lumpur for 2 days, Ho Chi Minh for a day, back to California for a day or two, and then to Colorado. I didn't stop flying east until I got home. It was a long trip. Long trip. But the longest trip I've ever made, the longest journey I've ever made, has been about 12 inches from my head to my heart. And that's the trip I want us to look at here. And I want to look at two conversations that Jesus has. One is very private, very intimate conversation with His closest friends, the disciples, His followers. And then is really legitimately kind of His last press conference He gives. So the first is in Matthew chapter 16. We're going to be both of them out of Matthew. If you have your Bibles, turn over there. Matthew 16. I'm going to start down in verse 13. And here's what happens. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now here's what's going on. They had been ministering all along the Galilean coast, and now they go up to Caesarea Philippi, and it was a long journey. And Jesus gets them up there, and he pulls them aside, and he has this very private conversation with them. Who do people say the Son of Man is? Who am I? And they start responding, don't they? Look at what they say. They replied, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. In other words, the papers are saying this about you. Some think you're this masterful prophet. Some think you're a reincarnation of somebody. Some think you're speaking prophetically to us in a way we've never been spoken to before. In fact, most of the polls are showing that you're kind of leading right now. In the U.S., we got a lot of that going on with all this presidential stuff and who's in charge and who's not in charge. Who do people say that I am? It's interesting. The very first time I went to Israel, this passage made so much more sense to me. Caesarea Philippi was a place where every god you wanted to serve, every god you wanted to worship, every altar you wanted to bend your knee to, every idol you wanted to purchase at a corner mart, it was in Caesarea Philippi. You get to Caesarea Philippi, and still today there are these carvings in the wall, these altars, these crypts were places where there were all the gods. You could get any god you wanted. You wanted a god to help you digest your food, you get that god. You wanted a god that was going to help you get your crops to grow, you go get that god. There was a god for everything and everyone, and Caesarea Philippi was the center of that. I suppose today that could be in our own hometown. We have so many gods today, don't we, that we bow down to. And it's in that setting that Jesus says, who do people say that I am? Then he turns it. That's what he says next. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? There's an awkward moment there. Fred talked about awkward moments last night. Awkward moment. That's an awkward spot right there. Recently, I was with my two granddaughters, and Diane and I took them to the theater. And we went to see the Cinderella show. And they were the first time they'd ever done live theater, and it was the big production, and it was awesome. I was sitting in between my 4-year-old granddaughter, Bria, and my 6-year-old granddaughter, Addie. And at one point, somebody kissed somebody on stage, and my 4-year-old granddaughter turned to me and said, "Well, that was awkward." And worse than that, I got home that night and I was telling her parents about that, and her mom said, oh, just last week we went to her doctor for her 4-year-old checkup, and the doctor had her lay down, and he started to take the stethoscope, and he went up under her shirt and started listening to her heart, and as he put his hand up under her shirt, she said to him, "Well, this is awkward." My granddaughter could have been sitting around this campfire right here with Jesus. Hey, I know what the papers say. I know what the polls are saying. I know what the crowds are saying. There they are. That little group that had been on a several-year camping trip with him. What about you? Who do you say that I am? You know, one of the problems when we read the Bible is we have no idea how long things took from one statement to another. But I'm guessing there was a long silence. Shuffling feet, looking down. It's Peter who answers. "You're the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." And Jesus replies, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but my Father in heaven. And I will tell that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not overcome it." You are the Christ. You are the one. You are the hope. You're the promise. You're the one that God has been talking about from the beginning of time forward. You're the one who's going to fulfill the promises in the story. You're going to bring hope to our hearts. You're going to fix the hole in our heart. You are our Lord. Who do you say that I am? And ultimately, that's a question we all have to answer. Not corporately, as a body, personally? Who do you say that I am? And how you answer that question actually ends up determining how you answer almost every other question in your life. Who do you say that I am? And Peter makes that great confession, you are the Christ. And Jesus blesses this rock of commitment. He blesses this pronouncement. He blesses this confession. He blesses this acknowledgement. And he says, on this rock, on those words, on that faith, on that understanding, I will build my church. Look at that statement again. Here's what he says about the church. It was personal. It was personal. It was going to be him actively engaged. It was something that hadn't happened yet, but was going to happen. We'll build, it's an active idea. There is something going on. It's not static. It's not stagnant. There is this sense of ongoing building. I will build my church. It is his church, not my church. It is his bride, not my bride. It is his body, not my body. And sometimes in the church, we get that screwed up, don't we? I get to be with a lot of pastors, and I'll admit for me, it's just, I get why we say it, but sometimes when someone says, well, at my church, here's what's happening, or at my church, here's what's going on. It is not my church. It is his. I will build my church. And what did he say? And all of hell can't stop this. All of hell won't stop this. And history tells us what unfolds, doesn't it? It's not long from Peter makes that confession. I know you are the Christ. And over the next few months, it's going to move from knowing to knowing. Exactly what Fred was talking about last night. Peter's going to go from knowing to knowing. And that journey isn't very far, but it is the longest trip I think you'll ever take. It is one thing for me to know, and it is another to know. I will build my church. We have the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. There's something phenomenal. We take this ragtag bunch of followers who end up scattering, who end up blowing it at the end, who when Jesus needed them most, but were gone. It wasn't just Judas who betrayed, the rest did as well. Jesus raises from the dead, and something dramatic happens, and they gather together, and they wait, and we know what happens. The day of Pentecost comes, and the church is birthed, and Peter gets up and boldly makes this statement, this Jesus whom we have crucified, God has made him Lord and Christ. And they were conflicted, and what do we do about that? And that day, 3,000 of them give their hearts to Jesus, and then not longer after that, 5,000, and the church exploded from Jerusalem and through the country. And today, we gather in this part of the world as his church. There's a lot of concern in the States today about what's happening in the church, and every way that we can measure things, the church seems to be declining. The reality is that all of those casual Christian things that so many of us we get caught up in, where we're just kind of consumers, where we go because there's something of benefit to us, where we know but maybe we don't know. It's less popular today to say you are a Christian than to say you aren't a Christian. So it's much easier today to say, no, I don't believe anything. Culturally acceptable. But God said his church would prevail. We were over at a lake place we like to go to last summer. I flew over with our granddaughters, and we have three, by the way. I meant to bring pictures. I'm sorry I didn't bring those. I have three granddaughters, 6, 4, and almost 2. And they're expecting another one, a little boy this time. That's awesome. We're excited about that. And he is due on November 7th. My daughter-in-law is pregnant, due November 7th. My daughter is due on November 7th as well with a little girl. So our house is about to change again. And I love, grandkids are great. I mean, they're the reason I'm glad I didn't kill my kids when they were growing up. They were awesome. And so we took them over, and I'm on the back porch, and Addie, she's now 6, said to me, hey, Papa, can I get your iPad? I want to watch a movie. Now, we're in rural Missouri, and sometimes cell phone is a bit spotty there even, and this is kind of the Ozarks, if you're familiar with the states at all. And I'm sitting on the back deck, we're looking out at the lake, and she takes my iPad, and she punches in my password, and she goes on to Amazon, and she downloads a movie, and 5 minutes later, she is watching a movie on her back deck, and my 5-year-old granddaughter thinks, this is how the world has always been. Because it's all she's known. Now, some of us in the room are old enough to remember that the only time you got to see The Wizard of Oz was when the networks decided they were going to show it, and they showed it in October. And if you didn't see it in October because your parents wouldn't let you watch it or you were out doing something, you had to wait a whole year before you got to see that movie again. And then we went to videotape and DVD, and then in the U.S., the big chain was Blockbuster. I'm not sure which one of yours there, but Blockbuster was where you go, and you went in there, and they had thousands of movies, and you could rent the movie for a day or two. And then we went to Redbox in the U.S., where there were, on every corner, there were these boxes where you just went up and stuck your card in, and you could get a movie. And then we went to Netflix, and now it's Hulu, and now I can watch a movie on my phone, and I can sit anywhere I want, almost anywhere in the world, and I can get the content I want. Last year, Blockbuster closed 14,000 of its retail outlets in North America, filed bankruptcy. Their business was the movie business, and they missed the turn. They missed the turn. And one of my fears for the Western church, particularly for us in the States, is that we're going to miss the turn. In fact, in my city right now, I can drive around. I was just with somebody the other day, and they were pointing out things in our city, and there's a new building going in with some medical clinic stuff in it. And here's what they said: that used to be a Blockbuster. And I can drive you through a lot of cities in the States and look at a coffee shop or an art gallery. That used to be a church. Because I think God wants to do something in the church, but He's inviting us to be active in that. He's inviting us to pay attention to what's going on. London Transit Authority had one of the biggest marketing faux pas a number of years ago. They were running behind with their schedules. They were creating a lot of customer angst, and people were angry and frustrated. And so they took out an ad in the London Times, and they apologized for their buses running late, for their schedules. And you know, they tend to be fairly precise over there, but they were having problems. And so they made this big apology. We're sorry for the inconvenience we've caused our customers. We apologize for any delays we've created for you. And they should have stopped there. But they went on and said this: however, it is impossible for us to maintain our schedule if we're stopping to pick up passengers all the time. Think about that. Sometimes in the church, sometimes we get more caught up around, are we doing the latest and greatest program? Are we doing the thing that some other church is doing? Have we bought the kit in the box that we can bring in and make things work for us? And I think God is simply inviting us to be His people who not only know Him, but know Him. Jesus said, I will build my church. It is His church. It is His people. And if the picture of the church today was simply a reflection of just you, what would it say about the church? I'm not a theologian like Cornet. I love listening to him, and I'm just amazed at how he digs into so much history, and not an orator like Stephen, and have a powerful testimony like that. It's brilliant. And I'm certainly not a prophet like Fred. I don't have that gifting. I'm a practitioner. I'm just a sales guy, actually. And at our church, when I went there, I didn't think I was going to end up doing ministry, and I did. And I went there in 91, and we were a 100-year-old church, and very traditional. And so I started asking some questions, and here's what I've learned. Those questions have shaped how we've moved forward. One of those questions was, how do we get people who don't go to church to start coming to church? And so we started doing things, like you do. We opened up a lot of doors to recovery things and children's stuff and student stuff. And I wanted to get people who didn't have any interest in church coming to church. And we were fortunate. Our church started growing, and 85% of those were coming to Christ. And it was going well, and I should have been feeling good about that. But there was a question that kept honing in on me. And this question was, if our church disappeared, if this congregation were no longer here, would anybody care? Would it make any difference in our city? And that question led us to getting involved. I think several times ago I talked about that stream going by the front door, and we chose to try to get in that stream, and it's messy and muddy and murky. And then we started asking this question, how can we be not the best church in our community? You know, that's what a lot of us in the U.S. want to be, the best church in the community. We want to have the best preaching, the best facility, and the best student stuff, the best music. And we asked a different question. We wanted to ask this question, what would happen if we were the best church for our community, not in our community? What would that look like? And what did that mean? It meant for a lot of shift. But here's a question that's been driving us, and it's the one I want us to move towards today. It's the window I want to open up for us just a bit. What would happen if, as a church, we got better at the two things that Jesus said mattered most? What would happen if we didn't focus all of our energy on the gathering, but we actually spent as much of our time on scattering as we did gathering? What would happen if we would do those two things that Jesus said he cared about most? Flip forward to Matthew chapter 22. I want to go now from the private conversation to this public conversation. It's almost Jesus' last press conference. The Pharisees come and they ask a question about taxes. And then the Sadducees come and they ask a question about the resurrection. And Jesus shuts them both down with some brilliant answers. And now we're getting to the last question in the press conference. Here's what's happening. Down in verse 34, hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, the Pharisees got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with a question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? And Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. Here's what he says. All of the law and all of the prophets hang on these two things. Love God and love your neighbor. Love God and love the people around you. And here's what Jesus said. Everything that God has said before, every command he's ever given, every prophetic voice that has come, everything that God has spoken up to this point hinges on these two things. Love God and love your neighbor. And if you want the door of your life to swing more freely, hang your life on those two things. If you want the congregation you serve to be more of what God invites you to be in your city, hang your door on these two things. Love God and love your neighbor. And they're not easy things for us to do, are they? To love God. To love God with all your heart, all your essence, all your emotion, all your passion. To love Him with your soul, the very core of who you are, good, bad, and ugly. To love Him with your mind, your intellect, your questions, your thing. God isn't inviting me to an empty-headed faith. He's inviting me to know Him and to know Him. To know Him. I didn't grow up in a Christian home. Many of you have. Some of you haven't. My parents were in pretty dysfunctional families. My dad, his dad moved 14 times by the time he was in 8th grade, so my dad quit school when he was 13 years old, didn't go back. One of my dad's grandfathers built the state prison in upstate New York. His other grandfather lived in it when it was done. That's the true story. In fact, we can never do family reunions. We can't get parole dates to coincide for us. So, my mom's family was equally dysfunctional. Her mother, my grandmother, ran away and joined the circus when she was 15. She was one of the ladies you threw knives at. You know, it's like if you met my grandmother, you'd probably want to throw a knife. And I remember being with some of you have warm, fuzzy pictures with your grandparents. You know, cookies and milk and on your lap. And I remember being with my grandmother. We're sitting outside in some lawn chairs on her city block, and she'd sent me down to the corner. I was like 10 years old to buy beer. I went with a note to the grocer. Let Ricky buy beer. He did. And so I brought it back to my grandmother. We're sitting out there, and some woman goes walking by, and my grandmother says to her, "You think you're something special? I slept with your husband last week." So that was kind of my that was. Yeah, I didn't have that warm, fuzzy, like little things some of you got going on the grandparent thing. And my mom was actually primarily raised in foster care. Her mom would be there and then disappear, and she would disappear for sometimes weeks, sometimes years. She remembers one time she was 4, her brother was 2. My grandmother had taken her to a bar. When it closed down that night, Mom was gone. Some stranger took her home. So not the most functional background. My mom and dad got married when they were 18. They both would admit they had no idea what they were doing. They decided they were going to try to make a different life, and they did. Faith wasn't a part of our lives. We were value people. There were morals. They wanted us to be good, but there wasn't any sense of connection to God. And I was in high school when a neighbor invited me to go on a student retreat, and it was the very first time I heard there was a God and that God loved me. Now, I'm enough of a skeptic. It took me a while to process all that, to think about that, but I started digging in, and I couldn't shake that there was a God who cared for me, a God who loved me. I couldn't get out of that. I couldn't get that out of my head. I couldn't get out of my wrestling, and then there was that day when I accepted Christ, and I'm so grateful for that. But it's kind of cool in our family because grace changes things, doesn't it? Grace changes things. Wasn't long after that, my mom and dad became Christ followers. And not long after that, my sister became a Christ follower. I'm so grateful because 2 years after her decision, she ended up in an accident with a drunk driver and is at home in heaven now. And my mom and dad experienced a lot of tragedy. They've lost 4 kids. There's been a lot of grief. But I've watched faith change our family. I got to baptize my dad's parents, my grandparents, my mom, who she had reconciled with. We got to lead her to the Lord, my aunts and uncles. One of my cousins just quit his job at the school district where he was a guidance counselor and has gone into ministry. I've watched grace change our family. Change the trajectory of our life. I've watched as we've tried to go from knowing to see what God does. Do you remember the first time you heard? There was a God who cared for you, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, no matter how ugly your past has been, no matter how much tough stuff you've experienced. And there's a whole bunch of us in here that need to quit hoping for a better past. Because there's a God who wants to redeem us, reconcile us. He wants to fix the hole in my heart. You remember the first time you heard? Watch this video clip we're going to cue. You remember the first time you heard? Hear him. I love you. I love you. I love you. Your warts and your wounds and your wobbles, I love you. All of the stuff from the past, I love you. All the ugliness that you brought, I love you. In the midst of that thing you're wrestling with right now, I love you. Even with that sin that's tripping you up, I love you. Even when you don't act like I want you to act, I love you. Do you hear him? You remember the first time you heard that? And here's what Jesus says. God loves you. Love him back. Hang your life on loving God. With every fiber of your being, with all of who you are. Love God. But Jesus doesn't stop there, does he? He says, and just like that, love your neighbor. Here, Jesus is closing the loophole on love for us. He's saying, love God. And if you love God, then it ought to flow in and through you. It ought to be expressed in your heart and your life. And that ought to show up in how the world gets to hear for the first time that I love them just like I love you. And it happens when you love your neighbor. Love your neighbor. Loving God's hard enough, isn't it? And God's been so good to me. How could I not love him? He's been so gracious to me. He gives me a second chance and a 12th chance and a 100th chance. He keeps inviting me back. God's grace extended to me. That's hard to love him because sometimes I love other stuff too. And now he ramps it up and he wants me to love others. I don't, let me just be straight. I don't even like others, actually, most of the time. People are different than me. We have different values. We have different skin tones. We have different customs and practices. We like different foods. We travel differently. We love others. God's inviting me to obey, to be a person who has God's heart toward my neighbors, to obey Him in that, to close that loophole. If I'm going to love God, I'm going to hang my life on that. But a door doesn't swing freely when it's hinged only in one spot. And some of us have gotten very good at loving God, and somehow we've excused our loving others. And then there are some of us who've gotten really good at loving others, but we really haven't loved God. And here's what Jesus is saying. If you want that door of your life, no matter what your door is, if you're a stay-at-home mom, if you're a plumber, if you're a doctor, if you're a pastor, hang your life, your door, on these two things. Love God and love others. Love your neighbor. And here's what I think he's saying. Actually love your neighbor. Your real neighbor, like the people who live near you, next to you, around you. Because here's what I know is true about me, and here's why this journey's been a tough journey. I'm okay with loving others who are distant from me. But the hardest work I've done in the last 3 years is actually to try to be a better neighbor. A better neighbor to the people around me. So let me give you a couple of things that we're encouraging our church to do to be better neighbors, some action points here. First of all, I want you to stay. I want you to stay connected. Be a person who gets to know your neighbors, because most of us don't actually know our neighbors. We don't actually know the people around us. We're pretty good, especially in the U.S. I come into my subdivision, I flip my garage door opener, and I wave as I go by if they happen to be staying out there, and I get in, and before I get out of my car, I hit my garage door opener again, and boom, it goes down, and I'm in my house. Now, I know my neighbors. It's kind of like, yo, hey. And I've been a good neighbor. Here's what I thought being a good neighbor meant. My dog didn't crap in your yard. I try to keep our grass cut. And I smile and bring cookies around sometimes. Here, I want to do a little exercise we do at our church. I'm going to put up this sheet up here, and there's going to be like a tic-tac-toe board on it. I think we've got, is that there for me? We call it the sheet of shame. See the one in the middle? That's where you live. That's your room if you're in a dorm somewhere. That's your apartment in a condo. That's your farm. It's your house in the cul-de-sac, okay? And the other 8 around that, those are your 8 closest neighbors. Now, here's what I want you to do. I want you to just pick 3 or 4 of those. And I want you to answer 3 questions. Tell me their names of the people that live in those houses, those 8 houses around you. And then tell me something about them. Like, you know, she's a nurse. He works for IBM. And it doesn't count if he has like Joe's plumbing truck in his driveway and you get to see that, okay? That doesn't count. Tell us something about them. And then tell us some hurt or hope or dream they had. You know why I call it the sheet of shame? It was the very first time I did this with our leadership team 5 years ago. I couldn't, my wife answered some of these questions. I did not even know the names of the people right next door to me. I kind of knew them as like, hey, yo. And we want to turn hey, yo into hey, Joe, okay? And so get connected. Learn who they are. And there's some ways to do that. Jim Collins, the author of the book Good to Great, when he was a professor at Stanford, went to one of his mentors and said, how can I be a better professor? I want to do a better job engaging. And this guy, Collins said, gave him some of the best advice he'd ever received. He said, you're working really hard to be interesting. I would suggest that you don't work so hard at being interesting as you work at being interested. Big difference, isn't there? Which kind of person are you? Are you the person who walks in a room and says, here I am? Or are you a person who comes in the room and says, hey, there you are. There you are. What if we were living like that in our neighbors? What if I actually took the time to get to know someone? You want to know why this has been hard work? I made a commitment a while back that if any of my neighbors were out at all when I got home, I wouldn't put my garage door on. I would go across the street. I would go down a block, a half a block, and I would have a conversation. It wouldn't be a long conversation. It would be a hello conversation. The other night I was coming home from my office. It was 10 o'clock. I hadn't had dinner. Yeah, I was tired, and I was just praying as I was coming on. God, please, please. Clearly my prayer life needs more work. My neighbor was out in his driveway. I walked over, chatted with John for a little while. Went in my house, and about a half an hour later, I got a text from him. We'd by then exchanged mobile numbers. He said, I've never asked you to do this before, but we're having a challenge with one of our kids. Would you pray for him? 3 years ago, I didn't know John's name. Stay connected. The second is pray. Pray. Be a person who talks to God for the good of your neighbors. Don't talk to your neighbors about God until you've talked to God about your neighbors. Are you praying for them? And here's what I would suggest. I'm not going to invite you to pray for them to become Christians. That's not our whole goal here. I'm going to pray because I am a Christian for my neighbors. And maybe be ready to be the answer to your prayer. God's worked on my heart on this a lot, of inviting me to actually pay attention enough for my neighbors that I knew things to pray for them. And also to be open to maybe being the answer to that prayer. If I'm praying for my neighbors to be friendlier, maybe I start with being friendlier myself. Play. Be a person who opens your heart and your home to your neighbors. I think eating and drinking can be the most spiritual thing you do in your week. Look what Jesus did. You go through the book of Luke, Jesus was either on his way to dinner, at dinner, or coming from a dinner. Do you know how Jesus gets described by the people? A drunkard and a glutton. So obviously he was doing a lot of eating and drinking with these people. In fact, a lot of the people put Jesus to death for his table manners. Who he was hanging out with at the tables. Play. Our building at LifeBridge on our main campus is about 125,000 square feet. It's not huge, but it's a good facility for us. And here's what we've done in the church. I think we've invited people to come. We create gathering spots, and we invite them to come to worship, and gathering for worship matters. And I don't land in the camp that thinks we ought to get rid of the gathering. I don't know how we'd ever do that. God's invited us to gather. But we often make the church the ministry center, and what if it were the resource center? We also often make the church more about programs. What if we made it more about people? We often make the church more about the gathering, not so much the scattering. And here's what I know. If I take the families in our church, and I take the number of homes they have with a kitchen in it, and I think the average size kitchen, it multiplies into millions of square feet of space that God wants to do ministry in. If I would be a good neighbor who would open my heart and my home to my neighbors, have them over for a barbecue, go to their party when I get invited, find ways that I'm engaged in the life of my neighbors. Stay connected, pray for them, play, and it opens the door to be a person who shares the story of grace. Doesn't have to be a dramatic story like Stephen's. Most of us have an ordinary story. But God's done something in your life. And this isn't us getting our Bible out with the 6 lessons we have and whacking somebody over the head with it and you got to find Jesus. It's not that. Don't be weird. Okay? Like, most of your neighbors who aren't Christians think you're already odd enough. And don't go in with the turn or burn t-shirt on or, you know. I went to a restaurant the other night for the very first time. I went to this restaurant because 2 people told me how good the food was there. I didn't go because of some marketing campaign. I didn't go because I got a coupon. I didn't go because I saw a billboard. I didn't go because the owner of the restaurant said this is a great restaurant. You should come eat. I went because somebody told me they'd eaten there and it was good. I'm not that smart. But I know one thing, I was blind and now I see. Just be a satisfied customer. What would happen if you and I loved God and loved our neighbors? Because we're living in a time, particularly in the U.S., where we're being told, hey, keep your faith to yourself, keep it private, don't bring it to the workplace, don't bring it to school. I love what the great American philosopher Forrest Gump said. He said, when you go to the zoo, always take some food to feed the animals. Even though the signs on the bar say, don't feed the animals. It wasn't the animals who put those signs up. Because I was just a snotty-nosed kid who didn't know that I didn't know. Holes in the heart. Stuff. And then I heard there was a God who loved me. Loved me. And it's taken some time for that to go from my head to my heart. A long journey, a hard journey, tough journey. And how will we know when we know here? Maybe it's because the door of our life will swing a little more freely because we've hinged it to loving God and loving our neighbor. So Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus makes that bold statement that he was going to build his church, and it would be ongoing, and it would be prevailing, and it was his. And I think it's time you and I quit coming to church. Quit coming. And start being the church. Start living. Start living with his love and grace. And I used to think that meant that I had to get on a plane and go somewhere. Help people in need and serve. But what I know now is God's invited me to love where I live. And to be a good neighbor to my neighbors. Remember what Jesus went on to tell Peter? I'm going to give you the keys to the kingdom. I remember the first time my dad gave me the car keys. Oh man, that was awesome. I got keys. And with that, I got some freedom and I had some power. Because I get in that car, it was kind of a Chevy Malibu. There wasn't that much power, but there was power. And there was some responsibility with that, and there was opportunity with that. And I remember when I got the keys to the car. And Jesus has given us the keys. The keys to how to fix our lives, the key to how to get past our past, the key to find a hope and promise, the key to get my heart bound up, the key to redeem some of the stuff that I've done, the key to help me live with hope and promise in this day, the key that gives me some purpose in my life, the key that gives me a way to go forward. He's giving me those keys. In fact, he's giving you those keys, and here's what he said. I want you to go to hell and get your stuff back. Get your life back. Get your heart back. Get your dignity back. Get your future back. And if you aren't going to use the keys, maybe we ought to give them back. Love God and love your neighbor. Hang the door of your life on those two things. It is not enough for us to know. He wants us to know. So I want to invite you to stand, and I have no idea where you are. Maybe for the first time you're hearing there's a God who loves you. If that's you, we're going to invite you to come down, and there'll be some folks who want to talk to you about what that means and how to find that. Maybe for you, you've been struggling with tapping into what God wants to do in your life, and again, we want to invite you down for that. But here's what I know. I know that there is a God who cares for you. And if you know that, He wants you to care for the people around you. And when that happens, He builds His church.